Among the Tlingit tribe, the funeral ceremonies of wealthy elites often lasted a total of 4 days. These high personages, many or most of them being chiefs and subchiefs, would have their slaves sacrificed upon their death, under the belief that their souls would continue to remain their chattel property in the afterlife. Some, or many of the corpses of sacrificed slaves were thrown into the sea. The number of slaves sacrificed at a man's funeral was based on how rich he was. The richer the man, the more slaves he sacrificed. Born in 1834, Sheldon Jackson was a Presbyterian minister and missionary in Alaska, as well as in the western United States. He spent much time among the Alaskan Indians, learning their culture and customs. In his book, Alaska and Missions on the North Pacific Coast, he describes the slavery practices he witnessed. Quoting from Jackson, "As if their ordinary condition was not bad enough, the majority of the slaves are women. The men captured in war are usually killed or reserved for torture, but the women are kept as beasts of burden and often treated with great inhumanity. The master's power over them is unlimited. He can torture or put them to death at will. Sometimes, upon the death of the master, one or more of them are put to death, that he may have someone to wait upon him in the next world." End quote. The lives of these slaves were very precarious, as can be seen in the following quote from Sheldon Jackson pertaining to the burial customs of chiefs and the wealthy. He was traveling along in a canoe with some Indians when they passed an old Stygian village. The ruins he is referencing were those of an abandoned house. If those ruins had a voice to rehearse the scenes that have passed within them, the whole Christian world would stand aghast and horrified at the cruelties which it is possible for human nature to enact and even gloat over. When those great corner posts were placed in position, a slave was murdered and placed under each. When the houses were completed and occupied, scores of slaves were butchered, to show the power and wealth of the owner, that his slaves were so numerous that he could afford to kill and yet have plenty left. Founded and dedicated with human sacrifices, who can conceive of the aggregate of woe and suffering in those habitations of cruelty? Year after year, at the wild drunken orgies of the Indians, their horrid cannibal feasts, their inhuman torture of witches, their fiendish carousals around the burning dead, the long despairing wails of lost souls as they passed out into eternal darkness." End quote. William Duncan, sometimes referred to as the Apostle of Alaska, is quoted here describing some of the atrocities he happened to witness. Quote, "The other day we were called upon to witness a terrible scene. An old chief in cold blood ordered a slave to be dragged to the beach, murdered, and thrown into the water. His orders were quickly obeyed. The victim was a poor woman. 2 or 3 reasons are assigned for this foul act. One is that it is to take away the disgrace attached to his daughter, who had been suffering for some time with a ball wound in the arm. Another report is that he does not expect his daughter to recover, so he has killed this slave in order that she may prepare for the coming of his daughter into the unseen world. I saw crowds of people running out of the houses near to where the corpse was thrown, and forming themselves into groups at a good distance away, from fear of what was to follow. Presently, 2 bands of furious wretches appeared, each headed by a man in a state of nudity. They gave vent to the most unearthly sounds, and the naked men made themselves look as unearthly as possible, proceeding in a creeping kind of stoop and stepping like 2 proud horses, at the same time shooting forward each arm alternately, which they held out at full length for a little time in the most defiant manner. Besides this, the continual jerking of their heads back, causing their long black hair to twist about, added much to their savage appearance. For some time they pretended to be seeking for the body, and the instant they came where it lay, they commenced screaming and rushing around it, like so many angry wolves. Finally, they seized it, dragged it out of the water, and laid it on the beach, where they commenced tearing it to pieces with their teeth. The 2 bands of men immediately surrounded them, and so hid their horrid work. In a few minutes, the crowd broke again, when each of the naked cannibals appeared with half of the body in his hands. Separating a few yards, they commenced, amid horrid yells, their still more horrid feast of eating the raw dead body. The 2 bands of men belonged to that class called medicine men. I may mention that each party has some characteristics peculiar to itself, but in a more general sense their divisions are but three: those who eat human bodies, the dog-eaters, and those who have no custom of the kind. Of all these parties, none are so much dreaded as the cannibals. One morning I was called to witness a stir in the camp which had been caused by this set. When I reached the gallery, I saw hundreds of Simpsians sitting in their canoes, which they had just pushed away from the beach. I was told that the cannibal party were in search of a body to devour, and if they failed to find a dead one, it was probable they would seize the first living one that came in their way, so that all the people living near the cannibal's house had taken to their canoes to escape being torn to pieces. Occasionally the medicine parties invite people to their houses and exhibit tricks before them of various kinds. The cannibal, on such occasions, is generally supplied with 2, 3, or 4 human bodies, which he tears to pieces before his audience." End quote. William Henry Collison was an Irish Anglican missionary who spent 40 years among the Indians of British Columbia, Canada, and Queen Charlotte Islands. In the following quote, he describes how he saved a slave's life. "I was very much shocked to find that a young man, a slave, had been accused by the medicine men as having bewitched the chief and induced his sickness. In consequence of this, he had been stripped and bound hand and foot in an old outhouse, and thus kept for some days without food. I only learned this about 1 hour before the death of the chief, and it was well I heard it even then, as I learned that they had determined to shoot him, and a man had been told of who had his gun ready for the purpose. I lost no time in calling the chiefs and the friends of the deceased, and showed them the wickedness and sinfulness of such proceedings, and how by their thus acting they had probably kept up a feeling of revenge in the mind of their friend. They accepted my advice and had him unbound, and he came to the mission house to have his wounds dressed. His wrists were swollen to an immense size, and his back, from hip to shoulder, lacerated and burned to the bone by torches of pitch pine. He was deeply grateful to me for having saved him." End quote. In the following quote, Collison describes some of the slavery practices he witnessed in the Nass River region. Not infrequently when pressed by famine, which was not unusual amongst the inland tribes, they handed over their young children in barter for food. These were in turn passed to the hiders as part payment for their canoes, which were so necessary to the Indians in their hunting and fishing. I found a number of these enslaved amongst the hiders who had been sold in exchange for food when young. They had grown up in slavery and knew nothing of their own people or of their own tongue. Under the teachings of Christianity, the hiders granted them their freedom. Some of them returned to their own people, but the majority preferred to remain where they had been brought up under the improved conditions." End quote. In the next quote by Collison, he describes what some Indians of the Takus tribe did in order to impress the visiting chiefs and elites of the Nishka. Whilst there, the Takus, eager to impress their guests with a sense of their wealth and power, bound some 14 of their slaves and, having procured a young forked tree, placed it in position on the beach and then laid the slaves, who were bound, with their necks on the lower branch. The young men of the tribe then performed the death dance around them, accompanied by the noise of their drums and songs. Then, at a given signal, a number of them sprang on the upper branch, bringing it down by their united weight on the necks of the slaves, whose cries and struggles were drowned by the chant and drums. This was continued till their cries were hushed in death. Shortly after, when all were engaged in a feast in front of the camp, suddenly one of the slaves who had been placed nearest to the extremity of the branch, and had only been rendered insensible for a time, started to his feet, and uttering a wild whoop which awakened the echoes all around, rushed off into the forest. For a few moments all were paralyzed with astonishment, as he appeared rather as a spectre than a being of flesh and blood. Then, having recovered from their surprise, the entire band of young men who had acted as the executioners gave utterance to one united whoop and rushed off in pursuit of the fugitive. After a long chase, a chorus of howls, resembling that of a pack of wolves, announced his recapture. Soon they emerged from the forest, and marching the unfortunate captive to the place from which he had fled, he was again laid on the branch, on which a number of them jumped and quickly crushed out his life. As slaves were the most valuable property possessed by the Indians, this was done to convince those whom they were entertaining of their wealth. End quote. James Charles Prevost, Admiral in the Royal Navy, informed William Collison that when he was captain of the HMS Satellite, he made his first voyage up the coast, and was surprised at what he witnessed when landing at Fort Rupert. The heads and decapitated bodies of Indians were scattered all along the shore in front of the camp, being washed up by the waves of the rising tide. Admiral Prevost was informed that a fleet of Haida had raided the camp, carrying off slaves and killing anyone who resisted. The slaves of Indian masters were not always other Indians. An American schooner called the Susan Sturgis was attacked and pillaged by the Haida. The white men on board were stripped of their clothing and enslaved. They were eventually redeemed, or ransomed, by the Hudson's Bay Company. Collison was very much interested in preaching to the Haida and making them into Christian converts, but he found that the chiefs and other members of the ruling class were averse to it, fearing that it might lead to the liberation and loss of their slaves. In the following quote, Collison corroborates the sacrificing of slaves that others also witnessed. The following occurred at a quote, "It was not uncommon formerly, when the opening had been dug out in which the totem was to be erected, to bind one or more slaves, either male or female, and cast them alive into the opening. Then, amidst shouting and clamor, which drowned the cries of the victims, the great totem was hoisted up into one position by hundreds of helpers, and the opening around it filled in with stones and earth. On occasion a young woman, a slave, fled to our mission over 100 miles in order to escape such a terrible fate. The night before the day fixed for her destruction, she succeeded in launching a small canoe unaided and unperceived, and fled. The punishments and privations which she had passed through had prostrated her, and although we used every means to restore her to health, she succumbed to her injuries 3 weeks after her arrival." End quote. Oftentimes, at potlatches, large numbers of slaves were given away at the outset as a sort of preliminary to the event. The following quote by Collison tells of the Indians' lives before and after the arrival of Europeans and Christianity. "The tearing and devouring of dogs and human flesh was then almost a nightly practice in every heathen camp. Now it is unknown. Slavery has been abolished." End quote. In the following quote, Collison describes the slavery practices that his wife witnessed. "Whilst my wife was there administering nourishment to him, she noticed one of the slaves, a young man, bound hand and foot with thongs of bark. Her attention was drawn to him by one of the attendants, who kicked the poor wretch. He rolled over on his back, almost in the fire, being unable to help himself. At the order of the chief's sister, he was carried out by the other slaves and thrown in an outhouse behind, where he was confined. The medicine men had accused this slave of being the cause of his chief's illness. They had discovered that he was possessed of the evil spirit which was in the form of a mouse. If this could be expelled from him, the chief would recover. Consequently, this slave had been kept bound for 3 weeks, and had been tortured daily by burning him with torches of pitch pine to drive out the demon. Another slave had been instructed to shoot him should the chief die, and was stationed, prepared, with his loaded gun, beside him for this purpose." End quote. Collison here tells what happened moments later after the chief died. Quote, "Just then I saw the slave, with gun in hand, press through the crowd and pass out on his mission of death. I called 2 chiefs and requested them to prevent the deed. They at once rushed after him and were just in time. They cut the bark ropes and set the slave free, but he was unable to stand. The thongs of bark had cut to the bone on his legs and arms, and his back, from hip to shoulder, was literally roasted. I directed them to have him conveyed to the mission house, where my wife dressed his wounds and administered restoratives." End quote. In the next quote, Collison talks about the war trophies Indians took home with them after battle. The coast Indians did not usually take the scalps of those whom they slew, as was the custom of the Indians of the interior. They severed the heads, which they carried back as trophies in their canoes. The scalps being so much lighter, the interior Indians took those which they carried off in their belts." End quote. Collison describes the Haida's slave raiding and wars. Quote, The Haidas had been in the habit of making periodical raids on all the tribes of the mainland in succession. Now it was against the Tlingit, then the Nishkas, and after that against the Sipsians they fought. Then they would make an expedition away far to the south, on the east or west of Vancouver Island, returning after some time with many slaves and much booty. In addition, they frequently fought amongst themselves, the northern tribes against the south, or sometimes against the tribes on the west coast." End quote. The Haida went on a punitive raid against the Nishka tribe for having killed a Haida man when he was visiting them. Collison describes the tactics they used in raiding the Nishka. They gained a point not far from the villages overnight, where they drew up their canoes under cover, and having set a watch, lay down to rest to await the dawn. Early in the morning, with the flowing tide, they swept up on the sleeping villagers and landing, rushed to the attack. It had been arranged that half the warriors of each canoe should attack a lodge, whilst the remainder should guard the canoes and be ready to receive and bind the captives. With their base thus protected, the others stealthily advanced on the lodges. All this was but the work of a minute or two, as the Indian dogs in the camp, of which there were many attached to each lodge, had at once raised the alarm. But to little purpose, for as the first Indians aroused rushed out to learn the cause, they were either struck down or seized, and passed to the canoemen, who bound them and threw them into their canoes. Those who offered the most vigorous resistance were for the most part slain, though several Haidas fell in the attack, and many more would have fallen, but that they retreated as quickly as they had arrived. For the men of the other lodges which had not been attacked were fast rallying to the support of their friends. They were too late, however, to rescue those who had been captured, as the canoemen had kept the canoes afloat, and as the retreating warriors cast their captives into the canoes, they sprang in after them, and with a loud whoop they were at once well out on the river, with a fair wind and a falling tide. Some of their captives, however, made such vigorous struggles for freedom on the passage down the river that the canoes were in danger of being upset or broken. Fearing to face the open ocean with such desperate captives, they landed at a convenient point at the mouth of the river, and slew all who had thus resisted. Their scalps they left hanging on the face of a bluff hard by, and this incident has given the name of Kincliffe, or the Rock of Scalps, to this place, which has long been our leading mission station on the river." End quote. As Christianity and colonization progressed in the Alaska region, the Haida made peace with the Tsimshians. It was a good first step, but there was much further to go, considering that part of the peace offering the Haida presented to the Tsimshians, out of the kindness of their hearts, were slaves. John Mears, the Irish mariner, explorer, and maritime fur trader, noticed that some of the Indians' canoes were studded with human teeth, particularly on the stern and the prow. A Haida chief named Edinshu told Collison how he had made a mistake as a young man when he had the opportunity of going to England with a Captain Douglas, a British man he had become friends with. Quoting Collison, "Captain Douglas made blood relationship with him and gave him his own name. When about to leave the coast, he invited Edinshu to embark with him. 'If you accompany me to England, the country of the Iron People,' said he to Edinshu, 'you will receive many gifts, and perhaps you may marry Queen Victoria's daughter.' And I refused to go with him," said he, "because I was young and foolish, and preferred leading in the raids on other tribes and capturing slaves." End quote. Thanks for watching.